Solution Character Education Certification course. Everyone can be seated that's in the auditorium. Welcome to all of you that are watching online. And once again, if you've got your self-control unit, go ahead and be turning over to page LP6A. LP6A, it's right beside page 152. And as you're doing that, I just want to remind everyone of the books we have that are available. And of course, we have a lot of people asking what book do they need next. And of course, I know we're getting into the 6th and then the 7th chapter, but you're going to want to get, if you don't have it yet, you'll want to get a respect unit. Now, we're still a couple weeks, probably a month or two away from the respect unit, but we're still you'll need to have one. And if you don't have one readily available, and if you're overseas, just email us or message us on Messenger, and we'll be more than glad to send you a PDF teacher's copy of the Peaceful Solution Character Education Program Respect Unit, because it's very much needed to have a teacher's copy. But of course, now we only have that one available in English at this time. We'll be currently working on that in Spanish and French, but right now the Respect Unit's only available in English, so that way everyone knows. But we're working to expand that quite a bit. But it takes time when doing translations. But if there's anything else that is needed, we get a lot of questions about the class, and if there's anything else that's needed that we can help with, please don't hesitate to message us and let us know. We want to be able to get this information into the hands of everyone, and we know that this can work in every nation. It can work in all walks of life. It transcends all religions, cultures. It literally takes society and puts it into a place where we could eliminate what we know as war, death, and destruction. We could really put an end. Imagine, because we're going to get into tonight to chapter 6, and it's entitled Self-Control in Society. So I want you to think about that, self-control in society, and we're going to tie back in some things that David spoke about last class, but also some things we've covered throughout the program thus far. But we're going to mix it in with society and the lack of self-control that we see in society right now. And I don't know if you realize it, but the lack of self-control is very expensive. It's extremely expensive. And when you look at just the money that is spent on defense budgets for nations and start adding them up. Now, the United States defense budget is astronomically high, and of course it tops out the next 5, 6, 7 nations combined. It takes quite a few of them to even equal the amount the United States is spending on defense measures. But just take that for one instance, and if you're a teacher, get with your classroom. Google these things. And I know a lot of classrooms these days, they have the smart screens where you readily available have Google, where you can pull it up. But Google how much money is being spent on a national level. Because this is supposed to keep the country safe, right? That's what we say. We spend this money so you can be safe. And then start breaking it down to what's spent on a state level. And then break it down to what's spent on a local level. You'll finally break it down to households pay for alarms, and they have security systems on their houses, and of course that service costs money. And if you've never done just a quick study, you don't have to spend an enormous amount of time, but take time, if you're a teacher or if you're guiding a class, take time to show them the amount of money that's generated just to keep your things, your lives, your society supposedly safe in a society that is really out of control. And you'll find out it's enormous amounts of money. And if we could reinvest that same amount of money into citizens themselves. I once heard a speaker talk about, and I don't remember, and of course this was 2 years ago, so the defense budget has changed, but they were speaking about how well off American citizens would be if you would take the defense budget of the United States and divide it evenly amongst the population in the United States. How financially stable it would help make the citizens of our country. And you could eliminate social programs, so to speak. You could create businesses. You could better society and education just by doing one simple thing. But of course, when a society is out of control and everyone thinks the only way that you can be safe is to have a bigger gun, Well, if everybody thinks that, everybody's always building the bigger gun. And the bigger gun takes the bigger bullet. And we start this deception with our own minds that if we drop a bomb on this nation, we will have win. We'll win. But scientific studies have proven, and there's many out there, and once again, if you're a teacher, get your class together and show them, if a nuclear bomb was dropped, say in Europe or Asia, calculate and see what they're saying, what takes place with the wind currents as it carries the ash and the fallout, and see how many nations it affects that has nothing to do with that bomb being dropped. One thing that we can't escape is we're a society that lives on the same planet. And we can't escape that. We're pretty much stuck with that. And we're so technologically advanced now, when society, our government, and I'm not speaking down about government, but government is part of a society from a leadership perspective, when they make decisions to bring mass destruction, that affects everyone, no matter what country you're from. So think about that. We're going to get more into the local scale, but we have to understand not only the national level, but also the global level, because that's something we can't escape. Someone can say, well, I was born and raised in Texas, never been out of the state of Texas. Well, Texas is a huge state for one. It's a lot bigger than the state I'm from, I can tell you that. But even in the state of Texas, you wouldn't have to go very far to find trouble. It's very easy to find. In fact, you can, look at the news in Uvalde, and then look at our, every day you turn on the TV, if you didn't know where Eagle Pass or Reynosa or Del Rio, Texas, if you didn't know where these places were at, or Laredo, you do now. And they're always showing how many people are coming across the Rio Grande, which, by the way, it looks like there's almost no water. It's going to be a mud puddle here before long. I've seen in Albuquerque where they're talking about it's completely dried up. You can walk right across Albuquerque, New Mexico. So it's very interesting to see how all these things are taking place. But here, looking in, and we're going to tie a lot of this stuff together, and we're going to really consider the amount of money, consider the amount of time and effort that is put into trying to, instead of teaching self-control, trying to force some kind of control. And of course, when you're forcing or trying to get people to comply with self-control, that's not really self-control. And remember, the real test of self-control is what you do when no one else is looking. Well, this is what nations, they don't do. They don't trust each other. And of course, society in general. There's neighbors that don't trust each other. You don't have to be countries. You can be just living beside, in a community and still have many problems. Well, here we have chapter 6, self-control in society. And this is the note to the teacher. So once again, this information is given to the teacher to prepare the teacher's mind to get the teacher ready to present this to the class. The class will never see this, so it's very important that the teacher reads over this, does a little bit of research on it, and takes the information that's put into here to tie it together. Because this is we really start talking about how, we talked about in diplomacy in the acceptance unit, but we really start talking about how the self-control will be brought in through ambassadors of peace and through diplomacy. And I know diplomacy in the world, when you go to the UN, that just means play nice. It doesn't mean bring peace. It just means don't offend anyone. And when they leave, you can do whatever you want to do, but just play nice while everybody's there. Make it look great for the camera. And how do we know the UN doesn't work? Well, the UN's job was to bring peace and to keep everything on a global scale. Well, the UN's been around for a long time, and I think we're a long way from peace. And I'm not blaming the UN, but obviously, if the ingredients to the situation is not developing the product you want, it's time to start examining the ingredients or the steps, the direction that a organization is going, and then you have to examine that. But here we see, now it takes an honest person to admit this first one. There can be people that would not admit to this, but I think the majority of 99.9% went out with this. And the statement is, no one can deny that we live in a troubled world. Not just a troubled city, not just a troubled nation, but we live in a troubled world. We see, and a lot of things are being, well, before COVID, it wasn't this bad. Yes, it was. Before COVID, it was really this bad, and it's just getting worse, and it's gradually getting worse every year. We can't truly blame, a respiratory virus and say that's what made everything go downhill. Last time I looked, COVID doesn't sell drugs. COVID doesn't pull triggers on guns. COVID doesn't do many, many, many things that society is blaming it for. And I can't tell you the many times that I've read to where doctors say that these deaths are COVID related, but it was due to another disease that someone already had within their body, and their body could not process the disease along with the COVID, and it led to them dying. So COVID gets a lot of credit for something that it really doesn't deserve. And I'm not trying to make it a light statement about COVID. It's a very nasty virus. And it's not something that I haven't experienced it. I don't want to experience it. I want nothing to do with it. But I wouldn't want that to fall on anybody. But obviously it is going to fall on people. And it's something that's a challenge to come with. And of course, one of the things that we found out, the troubled world we live in, people, even though they know they're infected with a virus that spreads easily, when it comes to wear a mask, make sure you're using hand sanitizer or something to clean your hands. Make sure you do something to protect your fellow person. Well, when we've seen that in stores, we've seen fights in stores and parking lots and airports, there's a lot of people that they don't want to do these things, but there comes a time in society to where if you have to inconvenience yourself a little to protect people around you, that should be something we're willing to do. Remember, that comes with a character trait that we talked about in the character unit called humility. Just making sure we can humble ourselves to do whatever needs to be done to get through a situation. Well, society's not doing that. And here we see the next sentence. It says, crime and violence statistics verify just how dangerous society is. Once again, this book was in 2005. That's where we really printed this book. I want to show you something here, though. And this chart really shows what's going on. It's just a bar graph, but it shows the skyrocketing of crime. And it shows the years here. You see 2011, 12, 13, 2014. It was up and down just a little bit. It was really bad. But we're measuring, you got to keep in mind, the big numbers we're going to go to measures off of crime that was really bad. You're talking about, we'll read the numbers here in a minute. We're not talking about 1 or 2 murders. We're talking about thousands. And that's what we're starting with. But you can see as we went through to 2015, 2016, it kind of spiked. 2017, 2018, it dropped, went back to where it was really bad to begin with. And then you get to 2019 and then 2020. 2020 has skyrocketed, and you can see the chart here. So this is, notice, they're saying that this violent crime affected 4.5 people in every 100,000. So for every 100,000 people, 4.5 suffered a violent crime. And then you get into 2020, and it's 6.5. Now, I want you to think about this, because there's a lot of people that go, 4.5, every 100,000, what's the odds of that affecting me? Do you know how many people will go buy a lottery ticket for this Mega Million lottery ticket and think they're the one? And the odds of them winning that lottery, they have better opportunities of going through this right here than they do winning the lottery. Now this right here, it was narrowed down, and this is causes of death for 15 to 49-year-olds in the United States. And the reason they gave that number, that's supposed to be the most risk-taking ages there, is what they say. But I want you to notice the number 1 cause of death, we can zoom in just a little bit here. Number 1 is drug overdose at 47,301. And then you have cancers, cardiovascular disease. Then I want you to notice this right here. Here's homicides down here. Homicides was 12,858. That's homicides. People going to prison for this. Suicide was 22,603. You literally have 10,000 more suicides, and of course this is not for a whole year statistic. This is kind of broken up. This is labeled as annual deaths of 2019 just for that age group. But I want you to take a look at the difference between suicide is 10,000 more than homicide. And I want you to think about every time you see a homicide, how much you see we need to pass gun bills, we need to control weapons, we need to change the law, we need to do this, we need to do that. But the suicides are 10,000 more, almost double. You don't really hear, you see at the end of a commercial, call this 1-800 number if you're having mental problems or if you're contemplating suicide. Obviously, if you're dealing with a person, and I'm not saying those numbers don't work. I've talked to people that have made phone calls on those numbers, and they say that that number had helped them process something. I haven't met a lot of people, but I have met some. But consider what we brought also earlier in the program, to where for every one suicide you see that actually completed itself, there's also another 100 attempts that failed. These numbers are astronomically high. So here you have, for the top 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, the top 7 causes of death are drug overdose, cancers, cardiovascular disease, suicide, road accidents, and homicide. Something very interesting to note, and this is something you can research on your own time. People would think, well, cancer and cardiovascular disease, that's a little bit different than homicide or drug overdose. Well, it is until you do research and you find out that these are the end results of STDs. That these were also preventable if people would have used self-control. And I know there might be some people out there who go, I've never heard that before. Research it. Look it up. The information is there. This is well known in the medical industry. You know, it's not a secret that HPV leads to cancers in many parts of the body. Not just one. It's not limited, but it can spread through activity. And then, of course, you get down into where you have respiratory diseases and HIV, AIDS, drowning, fires, and so forth. But I went to print this out, and I didn't really look, and I'll kind of thumb through this here for you. But you see all these here? You got this one, and 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 this one. We're almost there. And that one. These are the mass shootings just for the first 6 months in the United States. Not just shootings, but mass shootings. And it's a total of 9 pages. And it labels the persons killed, the injured, the city and state, and the date in which it takes place. And you can readily go online and find these things, but you know, it's amazing when we look at this as a society, when you see something like this. There have been at least 314 mass shootings so far in 2022. There have only been 186 days. Now, this is just in the United States. You know, and I want you to keep in mind, when you have that kind of shooting taking place in your own country, you don't have to look to Russia to find an enemy. You don't have to look to China. You don't have to look up to Canada or down to Mexico. You know, sometimes you can be self-destructive. You're self-imploding. And then you have, you know, when it comes to homicides in the United States, you know, that's a race nobody wants to win. But usually New Orleans and Baltimore, they fight for that top spot. And sometimes St. Louis comes in behind and sneaks around them and takes it themselves. That's a number one spot that nobody wants. Well, here, this is Baltimore. I have to really zoom in on that so you can see it. That's probably as close as I can get it. Baltimore surpasses 200 homicides for 2022 in the weekend shootings they just had. So they've already had 200 deaths, and this is barely halfway through the year, and they've already recorded 200 deaths. That's one city. Now, you've got to start thinking and wondering, what in the world's going on here? What's taking place? Why would society be self-destructive? We've got law enforcement everywhere. Well, law enforcement's quitting too. Remember, they were burning police departments down just 8 months ago. I want to read you this on a global scale, just to get in your mind what's going on. Cardiovascular disease deaths globally was 19 million in 2019. Cancer was 10 million. AIDS was 863,837, almost a million. Now, you watch the news and they'll kind of talk like AIDS went away. You don't even see it anymore. But almost a million people succumb, not caught it, but succumb. Road injuries alone in accidents, 1.2 million people died. 1.2 million. Homicide, 415,180. Now, I want you to write this number down because this is something you really, it jumps out at you when you see it. Homicides, 415,180. That is an enormous amount of people that were murdered. Now, write this number up above it. Suicide, 759,028. Look at the difference between those two numbers. You almost have suicide double what homicide is. You know, have your students, have them write these numbers down, then have them to, why are these numbers so high? Why are we pushing such strict rules? Because, people shouldn't go around killing people. And no, it's not always shooting them. They stab them, they beat them, they run over them with cars. And I don't know if you've seen it. I'll try to get it for next class where a man was hit in Brooklyn, New York with a car crossing the street. He was hit just crossing the street. And as he's lying there after being hit by a car, here comes like 5 or 6 people out to, you think, check on him. But what did they do? They robbed him. They took his wallet, they picked his pockets, they took his watch, and then they left him. He just got hit by a car and they all seen it. And the first thought in their mind was, go rob him. And it was all on camera. Now, this is not an isolated incident. These things are taking place in our society where, how can I get the upper hand on my fellow neighbor here, or my fellow man, or my fellow citizen? And this is what we see taking place in society. Well, that's not self-control at all. And that is something you're not going to fix by, as you arrest someone, they're talking about in New York, you arrest them today, they're back out tomorrow. You can arrest them today and put them in jail for 10 years. If you don't teach them anything, when they come back out, you haven't helped them any. You just basically took 10 years of their life away from them, but you didn't educate them. And this is what we're talking about here, because this crime and violence, these statistics, they're not changing. It shows how different society is becoming. Recidivism is not going down. Recidivism in the United States is right at 78% right now. The last time we went to Washington, D.C. to meet with the senators that actually oversee the judicial for the correctional facilities, it was 74%. So it's went up quite a bit since then. Now, if you look at recidivism as people who get out of prison and they end up going back as a great thing, well, I don't know how that's a great thing unless you're making money off the prisoners who come back to jail. If you're owning a prison and you're making money, then I guess that's a great thing. But that's a failure in society. And if you were to sit back and if you look at everything that you worked on and 78% was rejected and sent back, would you consider that a great thing or a bad thing? Would you think you have to redo what the process in which you're creating or trying to fix things? Imagine a mechanic who's fixing cars and 78% of the cars he fixed comes back, so you have to do it again. I see a mechanic laughing really hard, so he would know that he'd be out of business fairly quickly. You wouldn't be in business very long. Think about any type of business to where 78% of it was rejected. A restaurant, 78% of the food was rejected. But yet our prison system is doing this and we're pouring millions into it. Why not offer education? Why not offer it? And people can say, prisons have educational programs. They do. You can learn how to be a much more detailed criminal. But I've been to prisons that really don't offer much of anything. They have a vocational program. You can take a 3-month plumbing course. And after that, you get rec and you get TV, and that's it. And when you're sitting somewhere for 20 and 30 years, that's not occupying much of your time. When you put someone into, a very small confinement, you cause their minds to become creative, to entertain themselves. Well, this would be a perfect time to educate people, to change this into an educational system. Of course, we could start in our schools first, and that's why we're encouraging teachers to teach this. If we started in our schools and educated with this mentality, we could reduce the prison population that is over 2 million people here in the United States now. We have more people in prison in the United States than all other countries combined. And once again, we're self-imploding as a nation. And I'm not blaming our last president or the president before him or the one before him or the one before him. But basically, we live in a system that has, over the years, become much worse. And as we went through chapter 5, we see it through television programming, music, even into the video games that have been created in, last generations where they didn't exist. In the 50s, video game would have been nothing. Who would have thought, what's a video game? When I was in high school, who has a cell phone? That was not common. These days, kindergartners get them. They call mom when they come pick them up because they got the cell phone in their hand. And think about what that gives access to. Well, continuing on here, but I really want your mind thinking about how all of these things in society are, if you were looking at it as a building, it would be the most decrepit building on the street. If you were going through an old town and you see the town through revitalization, well, morality is the building that's falling apart. That's the building, the whole building's starting to lean, the roof's caving in, the foundation's cracked, you can see it spreading out. It's pretty much falling apart, and it's about ready to completely implode. And when that building falls, a lot of people are going to hurt and suffer around it. Well, going back here to LP6A, it says, the threats of terrorist activity and nuclear war are constantly in the news, and they're in the news more today than it seems like ever before. Teachers, parents, and students remain anxious and fearful of school violence. It used to be when I went to school, my graduation year was 1991. And I started school, I don't know, I guess 78, 79. Went all the way through school. I never even considered a school shooting. Never even thought about that. Not a school. The worst thing that took place in our school was 2 people would get in a fight over something that made no sense. And that was pretty much it. There was no consideration that someone could come in and shoot the school up. Now, it's kind of an everyday thing. But when I was in school, students and teachers didn't form personal relationships that we knew of either. I don't want to throw our local city here of Abilene under the bus, but that's quite a common problem in the last 3 years in our local city here. And I'm not and I'm not trying to justify what's going on in our city that we have here, but it's something that's very different. When I went to school, our teachers were like grandmothers to us, and they were really great teachers. They had a lot of knowledge. Today, and I'm not saying teachers today don't, but the teacher ratio is turning over so much because teachers are just tired of being treated like trash. You can actually be a senior in high school now, and your teacher could have been someone you went to school with because you were a freshman or you were in the 8th grade when they were graduating. They finished their teacher course, and now they're back at the same high school teaching. So they're only 3, 4, 5 years older than you. Back when I was in school, our teachers were much older than us, and we would have never considered talking provocatively to them. Now, kind of like you were friends in school to begin with, and now they're the teacher. And that relationship to teacher-student is not being recognized, and morality is not being recognized. Well, notice here it says the cause of many of these problems is a lack of self-control, and that's what we're seeing all around us. The next paragraph here, it says, this lesson focuses on the effect of lack of self-control has on a society as a whole. So the effect it has on a society as a whole, not just our own individual lives, but how I'll use myself for an example. When I don't use self-control, it affects other people. And remember, for every action, there's a reaction. Like we talked about the ripple effect, and we'll get into that much more. But we talked about it in the character unit, and it's like when you throw a stone in the pond and you see the ripples go outwardly. Well, that's an action or a reaction to an action. When someone doesn't use self-control, then there's a reaction to it. And we'll get into looking at not just road rage or two people getting upset and one person doing something that cost another person their life. It was just a few years ago here in Abilene, we had at a stoplight, two men got mad because one person stopped faster than the guy behind thought they should. They got out, started arguing. One person dies over braking at a stoplight. These are things people shouldn't be dying for. We should just recognize that situations occur, not do things on purpose to try to cause harm to someone, and then move along. But we're not doing that. We live in a society now that I got to give them a piece of my mind. They can't get away without me knowing how displeased I am with them. Used to be you honked your horn. Then it graduated to hand gestures through the window. And now it's graduated to ball bats and guns. But here we're going to talk about three specific areas that will be addressed: crime, school violence, and road rage. Students will also learn how self-control, or a lack of it, can affect interaction between nations. How one nation and another will not get along. How one nation and another can't agree on very simplistic measures. For example, you would think nations could agree on, does Taiwan belong to China or does it not belong to China? I was just listening to the news today and I heard our U.S. Secretary of State. He said, we recognize the one state policy of China and Taiwan. It's one nation. And then it wasn't, but the next interview, we're going to be selling weaponry to Taiwan in case China invades. I thought it was a nation. Now we're selling. That's like Abilene is part of Texas, but we're going to be selling Abilene missiles in case Texas invades. It makes no sense, or in case the United States was to invade Texas. It's very bizarre to think that you can have it both ways. It doesn't work that way. And the whole mindset behind it, the concept behind it and the mindset is very confusing. Either you recognize it or you don't. And it's not just China. You can look at Ukraine. You can try to figure out Syria. You can go to Israel and Palestine. Just go to where you can't even decide who's the only border that I think we've decided is the one that runs south of Texas. We've pretty much decided if you're on this side of the river, you're in Mexico. If you're on this side, you're in the United States. And if you can get to the United States side, turn yourself in, and you're an American. You've succeeded. They make it sound that easy, but I can tell you, I go down to that border a lot. It's not that easy, and those people are not having a great time. And there's people that you send them back across the border, they go right back across, they check them in, they scan their eyes, they fingerprint them, they go right out the door, go right down, and right back a river they go. They're probably in Mexico a total of 45 minutes, and they're right back across the United States again. They're not, I'll give them one thing, they don't quit. And I've always told people that say, they have no reason coming across that border. I've always said, before you say that, go down there and spend about a month or two. And tell me you'd like to live there instead of the United States. You don't quite understand the difference a bridge makes until you go across that bridge. And it is a totally different, not just nation, it's a totally different world. And I think people that make those kind of comments, and I'm not saying that it deserves to be that way or those people should be allowed to come across. We have people that suffer in nations, and we tend to look on the other side of the world like we have to look to Somalia or Sudan or Yemen. You can look down to the southern part of North America, Central America, or South America. You don't have to look very far. and you see people that are dying, murdering, being sold, trafficking. We actually have kind of a spoiled life here in the United States, and it's very dangerous here, but it's a walk in the park compared to other places. You know, you don't have to worry about the United States, and I'm not trying to get graphic, but, you know, children should understand this too. In the United States, children can get stolen. They can get kidnapped, and we know that, and they can be put into many horrific things. Imagine being down in Mexico, Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras. Imagine your children being stolen so they could harvest their organs and sell them, because that's what's going on down there. And it's not a rare thing to see coolers on the side of the road, and it's the remnants of the baby because the cartel's already taken the organs and they're already on the market, and they sell them very quickly. They process them very quickly. We don't really go through that here in the United States right now. But when you start thinking about if you lived in an area like that to where, well, let's see, I can stay here, I can work 80 hours, and I can make $45, or I can go across the bridge. A lot of people are going to go across the bridge, and they're working for American companies, by the way. And these people that are making $45, they don't get meals, no one gives them housing, no one's paying their car payments or their electric bills. That's it. You get that money and you got to figure it out. Well, you know what? That leads to a breakdown in society. And when I'm saying this, what does that have to do with self-control? I want you to consider, if you have people that are making $45 and they have to fend off that, that's everything for them. And they're working for a multi-billion-dollar company here in the United States. And right across the river, if you do the same job, it pays you right at $20 to $30 an hour. But just because you're on the other side of the bridge, it's $45 a week. That's a breakdown in society. And that's something that society in general has to fix. That's a lack of self-control when it comes to, if you're a company worth hundreds of billions of dollars, you can afford to pay people a fair wage. But when that making the dollar and paying your investors is what you're concerned with, well, then we take advantage of people. Is that a crime? Well, if you're the one making $45 an hour, it's okay. If you're the one making $45 a week, I promise you, you're going to think it's a crime. Especially when there's nothing that comes with that. There's no food programs, no such thing as food stamps. There, you either make it or you don't. That's your only option. And when you can't make it, you either steal or you cross the border. And there's a lot to be said about that, but it's not just down there. We're talking about many countries involved in this. Road rage isn't much of a problem when you don't have cars on the street like many places in Africa. Well, here it says students will also learn how self-control or lack of it can affect interactions between nations. They will be introduced to the art of diplomacy and be challenged to practice skills used by ambassadors. And we've had the pleasure, and I say pleasure because it was a learning experience, the Peaceful Solution Character Education Program has met with every embassy that's in Washington, D.C. We have literally met and went to every embassy there, and that took place over probably about a 6-year time span. But if there's an embassy in the United States, I know there's not one for North Korea. The one for Iran was long closed. But if there was an embassy there, we've met with everyone. No matter how big or how small the country, no matter how fortified, like China or Russia's embassy in Washington, D.C., it's fortified. It's not easy to get an appointment to speak with anyone there. But we were able to do it. And I've told the story before, and I won't go into detail, but we've met with the actual ambassadors. And one thing, ambassadors, when it talks about diplomacy, they do great at making every situation seem like it's a great thing. And I'll never forget when we went to the Embassy of Mexico and we had our camera. We wanted to record our interview. We wanted to, get a lot of things on camera to show. And when we went in, they took all of our stuff. They took our microphones. They took our camera. And we had a wireless microphone, and one of the teachers since we were planning on recording, he kind of left it on, forgot all about it. It was of no use at that time because everything else had been taken. But it was kind of, it's a lapel mic, so it's under your tie and it's kind of on your hip pocket, still wearing it. And when we went in, we were telling the ambassador that, we came in, they took all of our stuff. It's like we were going to do this. And, oh, no. They didn't take it from you. They put it up so no one will steal it or so nothing happens to it. The last thing we want is for something to get broken in here. So we put it in a very secured place, and we'll even plug your camera up and charge it for you if you need. And by the time she was done, we were like, man, you guys are such great people. We kind of forgot we came for an interview to begin with. But she was very nice, but I learned a lot from these ambassadors. They say things, and I'm not saying she wasn't very helpful, but we really didn't get to address the problem that we wanted to talk about and kind of get it on camera. And we learned very quickly, even people of prestigious positions will talk very frank with you when they're not on camera. They will have a great in-depth conversation. When that camera's running, they will never repeat those kind of things because they're held to a different standard at that time. There's a sense where you can be very engaging and deal with situations, and then there's a time where you must be politically correct, is what they say. And I think we were better off having our engaging conversation because since that time, we've had a lot of things grow in that country and other countries that we met with their embassies. In fact, one time we went back to the embassy. Well, I won't say what embassy it was. One in Africa. I'll just say it that way. We have pictures of it we could show you. We were sitting, and this country had come to one of our events before. And it was myself and William. We were sitting in the reception room, and, kind of magazines all over the table. And, we're used to seeing peaceful solution books everywhere. And we sat there for 5 minutes, and it took me 5 minutes to recognize that the books that were on the reception table were all peaceful solution books. That's what they had put there for people to read when you're waiting to meet with the ambassador. And she actually would come to our events that we'd have at the Carnegie Endowment. And it's supposed to be an institute for peace. The peaceful solution was the most peaceful thing that's ever been there, I'm sure. But, these things are very engaging on how you can leave something and you can leave a trail. And as the influences we're talking about before with movies and music and interaction with negative people, positive people can do the same thing. Even books that we had left years ago. Here they are setting out for people that are waiting to meet with an ambassador. Usually pretty important people meet with ambassadors. They do not just meet with everybody. You can meet with the chief of staff or someone lesser, but to meet with an ambassador is pretty difficult. It's not an easy thing to do. And it's very interesting. If you've never had the pleasure, I think the most interesting one we ever had, we spent over an hour with the ambassador of Libya. Very interesting conversation we had with them. And this was after Muammar Gaddafi had been killed. And it was very interesting to, the stance they wanted to know, what do you think about Muammar Gaddafi? They started interviewing us before we could start talking to them. And, of course, we gave our stance of what we thought about Muammar Gaddafi, and they felt more relaxed after that because they felt they could speak more open. And, of course, there you wasn't going to record anything either. But once again, you don't solve problems just by recording things. They do that at the UN all the time. They record things, they argue, they say they're going to bring peace, and they don't. These are things taking place. You don't need a camera in your school to teach these things that will help prevent the things that we're going to experience. And becoming an ambassador doesn't mean you got to have some big office in a nation's capital. You can have an ambassador of peace. You can be one in your school, in your family, in society in general. That's what we need for ambassadors of peace. You don't have to have some kind of governmental check coming in a big office sitting in some prestigious city. So continuing on here, it says, in the previous lesson, students were taught how to practice self-control in their immediate environment and interactions. Of course, in our own lives, in our family lives, and also, dealing with our schools. Of course, this can also be used in workplace, but in our lives first. Remember, it starts at home first. That's where it begins. Remember where our first teachers we learn from are usually our parents or our guardians. That's the first people teach us how to walk, talk, and so forth. And then once we go to school, they help us to extend those experiences we've learned at home. You know, if you're going to school and you're still in a baby stroller, you're not going to do very well. You're going to have to get out of your baby stroller if you're capable of doing those things. And a person that goes into school, and if you've never been trained how to read, you know, they say the first 4 years in school, they teach you how to read. And if you can't comprehend it in the first 4 years, your education level will drop drastically, because from the 5th to the 12th, you read to learn. So you have to be able to get the reading part down and the comprehension in the first 4 years. That doesn't mean you master it, but you have to be capable of grasping and growing. Because once again, the first 4 years is learning to read, and from 5th to 12th is reading to learn. And that can be a challenge if you haven't. That's why you see a lot of extracurricular reading courses and stuff for students in school. But continuing on here, it says this lesson helps students gain a wider perspective on society. So wider perspective, you know, if you've ever seen a horse and it's got the blinders on so it can only see straight ahead, well, imagine you take those blinders off and now you can see everything around you. And it's not just really what you see that's in front of you, but it's understanding. Students at this time, after what we've covered thus far, when they're listening to a song playing on the radio, the lyrics to that song should be identifying in their minds very differently than what it was before they recognized how detrimental and how negative these effects can be on the mind, television programs, and so forth. These things should be very different. You know, I can tell you at one time, I used to be a huge sports fan. It's all I did through school. I played a lot of sports, and I loved it when I was growing up. Now I'm older. I still have where I broke bones playing sports and didn't care that I broke a bone. I wanted to go back and play some more. I didn't even want to come out when I broke the bone. But now that I'm older, I would have hadn't have broke the bone, because it doesn't stop giving you problems, or bones. But you look at what takes place today, and you see a society that people, if someone was to tell you this 275-pound man is going to run at full speed with a helmet on and he's going to hit this other 215-pound man as hard as he can from a standstill. And by the way, we're going to pay the man that's running about $15 million a year, and the guy who's going to hit, we're going to pay him about $20 million a year, and you're going to have to pay $100 to come in and see it. Sounds pretty bizarre, doesn't it? But if you want to see a lot of it, you can get this ticket that comes on your local satellite television station. You can watch all of them hit everybody. And we think, well, no one's ever died. I remember watching one of those games where somebody did. I remember watching one of those games where somebody got their neck broke and they're paralyzed. So yeah, people do get severely hurt. And when you think about it, it's pretty bizarre. But it's got a lot of drive behind it. And there's a lot of money behind it. Continuing on here, it says, should say it. I think it says I in your book. Some books say I. It should say it. My book says I. It should be the goal of every teacher of the character education to instill. Let me try this again. Mine's got a couple errors here. It should be the goal of every teacher of character education to instill within the minds and hearts of our youth a solid understanding that the thoughts, words, and actions of an individual affect society as a whole. The Peaceful Solution has devoted time and energy to create a program specifically for this purpose. So once again, notice it's a solid understanding of not just thoughts, but also words and actions. So when these things are put into play, you know, it's not just an I'm joking attitude, but no, there's some really positive things that once are solidified in the mind can cause a firm foundation for very positive things to take place. Notice it says your zeal, this is to the teacher, your zeal in implementing it will make a significant difference in how much students grasp and practice it in their everyday lives. And it's very important as teachers, as we said from the beginning, that this is not just a course you set for 30 minutes or an hour a day, and you go through it, and okay, we're done with that. Let's move on to the next. Like a science class. Okay, we had science for a day, 30 minutes or an hour, now we can move on, and you never discuss it again. The peaceful solution is something, whatever you cover, don't just build on what you covered, but build on everything that you've covered before. Build on all of those building blocks, all of that foundation that's been laid, and use it every day in your classroom. Don't just teach it and then let it slide by. It's not like in North Carolina, we had to take biology in the 10th grade. Didn't care about biology until 10th grade, and after 10th grade, didn't care about biology after that. You just had to have it to get your diploma. And the character education's not that way. You have to care about it from the very first step, first word. It has to be taught. Remember, we've talked about these character traits are skills that have to be taught and practiced. Well, if they're never taught, they're not going to be practiced. And if they're not going to be practiced, then we see a lot of no self-control, a lot of crime, a lot of violence, whether it be on our streets, in our cities, or in our schools. There will be a lot that takes place. And we're seeing it as a society. It's if you can imagine, you have a swimming pool. And you're standing in the swimming pool. And imagine this taking place over years. In the first 10 years, the water came up to your knees. And you thought, man, that could get bad if it kept going. And then 20 years later, without you really paying attention, you look down one day and it's at your waist. And it's still coming in, didn't even notice. And then another 15, 20 more years, you don't notice it again until you go to move your arm, and it's like right up above your arms. And then one day you realize it's right at your chin. And then you go, we probably should do something about that water coming in now. Well, we probably should have done something when we first noticed the water was coming in where it shouldn't be at. But now we're to the point the water's coming in faster and the time to fix it is almost expired. Well, can it be fixed? It can be. But I would dare say, from my experience and fellow teachers that have traveled to many places over the last 15 years, for most society, I think you're going to have a very devastating event before people go, we got to do something. And that's sad, because that means a lot of people are going to have to lose their lives for this to grab attention. And when I say devastating event, think about, when they talked about Uvalde here just not long ago. That's bad. It's already forgotten now. It's already behind. Not in Uvalde, Texas, it's not. But as far as a country, well, we've already moved on to the next shooting. That's 15 shootings ago now. And we've become numb to it. Well, it's going to have to be something that'll take place. And you never know. I don't know. I'm not trying to say something bad will take place. I'm not trying to be a pessimist. But people usually don't care what's going on in society until they believe it can affect them. Once they believe it can affect them, then something needs to be done about it. But that's the way society has become. As long as my life's going okay, it can all fall apart around me as long as it's not affecting me. If we're going to have a war, I've heard it said many times, we need to fight the war over in their country. They have women and children and men too that don't want war. They're the same as us. They don't want that in their nation, but what are we doing? Well, let's look over to start the lesson plan, and then we're going to cover just the first procedure. And the reason we're going to just cover this briefly is because David did a really great job of covering that last class on what I have learned. And if you want to go back and see the information, we're bringing all that together. If you ever see a topic, and I want to remind everyone of this because I got a phone call the other day and they said I was watching someone cover a What I Had Learned section in the acceptance unit because they were watching classes from what's on Facebook that's kind of there for a database, and they were wanting more information about it. And I told them, what I have learned is very brief. The things that were covered in chapter 5 goes through from David to myself to William and then Catan, There's a lot of information. What I have learned just kind of rehashes that in our mind so we can move to the next spot. But the detailed information that comes from that, always go back to the classes before that, what I have learned, and you'll get an enormous amount of information on not just what it is, but also presentation. Because these classes are more about provoking the mind to thought, but also to try to give you an idea of how teachers are teaching this. It's not just really to bring you in here and to talk about society's problems, but we bring up things to kind of stimulate your mind on things you can research, things you can check out, things you can add to your class, so when you're teaching it, you can put these things together to help your students in what they're going through. Because a class in Abilene, Texas will be different than a class in Los Angeles, California, which will be very different than Brooklyn, New York, which is very different than in Billings, Montana. You know, very, very different. So think about these things, because once again, one thing we're all trying to accomplish is building positive character education, building positive character within ourselves. But we need an education program that's globally, and that's what we're doing. But here on LP6C, our purpose and objective, of course, that's what we always start with, and this is our measurement. This is our scale to see whether we're succeeding or whether we're not. Students will learn how an individual's choice in practicing self-control affects society. Students will also learn that an individual's lack of self-control has consequences for society. Now, so once again, we get out what we put in. You know, they say that a lot whenever you're doing weightlifting and so forth. You'll only get out what you put in. Well, character education and building moral character, you can only get out what you put in. And if you are baking a cake and you're putting all the ingredients in and you're using the right things, just imagine someone pours just a little bit of gasoline in. What's it going to taste like? You know, you kind of want it done the right way, or else you're not going to get the full expectation of what you're doing. Well, here, procedure 1, it says, review the previous lesson, maintaining your self-control. And by asking students the following question. And we always start out with this, unless you're dealing with a chapter 7 of one book, and then to the next book you go to a chapter 1. The chapter 1 of the next book will be pretty much the topic of each chapter. But here we're reviewing chapter 5, maintaining your self-control. And the first question is, what are some influences that can affect your ability to practice self-control? The first thing I would encourage you to do, never take for granted when you ask someone what an influence is that they know. Because we have found out many times, and of course in this book it's covered on page 118, and we're going to go through those with the next class. In the character unit, you can put there to your notes to the side, it's on page 60. And remember, an influence is anything that has the ability to change the way you think, the way you feel, and the way you act. And that's what we're doing here. Part of our class is to influence people. We want to influence the way they think, the way they feel, and the way they act. We're not wanting to change who they are as a person as far as their personality. That makes society interesting. That's what makes society enjoyable. It's the breakdown in character is what brings the danger, the murder. You know, whenever you can look, and last year, 759,028 people gave up the desire to work forward to try to fix a problem. They felt like life was so broken they couldn't fix it, where they took their own life. You know, that's horrific. That's a very horrible thing that people go through in this. And obviously, we need to make a change. We need to make a difference. But we'll stop right there, because we're going to pick up with these influences and talk about those. Because when someone does something like that, they have to be influenced to do it. I would encourage you to go back and listen to the classes that Catan and William talked about the fentanyl problem. And if you're a teacher, go online. There's a lot of YouTube videos you can pull. 60 Minutes did a documentary on it. of how deadly it is just to make that drug. And then you have people that are getting it over here and ingesting it. And then consider the breakdown in society that it takes for something like that to transpire. So we're going to stop here on LP6C. We'll start back with Procedure 1 next class, and that'll be on 7/31, the 31st. That'll be this coming Sunday at 5:30. So thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you then.